Right now, tell me if this sounds familiar. Barreling yet again towards another fiscal cliff. This time it's called the Sequester. Why can't D.C. get their act together and get anything done before the last minute? We're going to tell you why. This time, it could throw the U.S. into a really big economic mess. And next, Frank Lautenberg will not seek re-election. We told you that yesterday, and Cory Booker already waiting in the wings. But the question is, did the mayor jump the gun by announcing his intentions too early and could it cost him in the upcoming race? And later, Rom for president? Could Rombo, or many other things as he's called, actually be a legitimate candidate for the White House with a real shot here? And what about the questions it raised? We're going to read the political tea leaves. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Thanks so much for joining us this Friday evening, February 15th. Now, as much as Hollywood loves sequels, so too, it seems, does D.C. First, we had threats of a government shutdown, then the debt limit fights, followed by a fiscal cliff, and now the latest sequel to the sequel to the sequel when it comes to the government finances, the Sequester. But if you're dismissing the Sequester as just more of the same or the latest threats without really any follow-through from D.C., you ought to think again. The impact could be a heck of a lot wider than any other fiscal fights we've seen recently, and tonight it very much looks like there's very little, if anything, D.C. can or is willing to do to stop it. Well, tonight, the politics of the Sequester and why so few people seem prepared to do anything about it. But first, we're going to remind you what this thing really is. That is the Sequester. And for that, I want to bring in our senior political correspondent, Andrew Whitman. And Andrew, first off, for anybody at home who says, I don't need this, it's Friday, let me tune this thing out, there's a good reason why they got to give this thing a few minutes here tonight, because it's very real and it's looking more probable than not we're going to actually face this thing here. It's not just D.C., hype without any substance.
Yeah, people need to pay attention, not just because I've been working on it all day, but also because it really has significant impacts, Rich. Until last year, most people had never heard of the Sequester before. That's because it hadn't existed before. Back in the fight over the debt limit, Republicans demanded spending cuts in exchange for increasing the federal credit card. Two parties couldn't agree on cuts, so rather than have the nation default, they extended the debt limit but set in place a set of automatic spending cuts as part of the fiscal cliff. Congress then punted on the fiscal cliff, leaving just all this. The Sequester, what is it? Automatic cuts to almost all federal spending. Now, after the fiscal cliff negotiations back on New Year's, the Sequester cuts were pushed back to March 1st. Today is February 15th, so there's still plenty of time to work out a deal, right? Wrong. Congress has next week off, leaving just 4 working days, February 25th, 26th, 27th, and 28th, until the cuts take effect. To get a sense of what the Sequester includes, let's start with the only things that aren't in the Sequester, and this very small list is it. Only these programs are exempted. Everything else gets the chopping block. And that block hits hard. More than 7% cut from the military and defense spending, and except for war and military pay costs, every defense program gets that 7.3% axe. Same thing on domestic spending. Anything not exempted gets cut by 5%. And when we say everything, we mean everything. From federal workers who will be laid off to port and border security, education cuts, FEMA cuts, air, water, and food inspectors, farm subsidies, meaning higher food prices, small business loans, FBI and law enforcement, even meals and nutrition programs for women, the poor, the elderly, and kids. For more on the economic and political implications of the Sequester, I spoke with Darren Samuelson. He is the senior policy reporter for Politico. Darren, we've had the fiscal cliff, we've had the debt limit fight, we've had threatened government shutdowns, now the Sequester deadline. Do we have a firm idea as to what the impact of the Sequester would be if it went through?
We're starting to see that impact right now as federal agencies across the government start to release details. It'll get obviously a lot more specific as we get closer to the March 1st deadline. And if it does come, I think in the days and weeks ahead, government agencies across the country are going to be kind of giving us a much clearer sense of where the furloughs are, what services are going to be cut back.
Is there a way to project out what the impact then becomes on the wider economy after the specific government agencies are impacted?
You're starting to see that as well. I mean, you've already heard from the Congressional Budget Office that we could be looking at a second recession overall for the whole country if sequestration happens, as people are laid off, as jobs, furloughs happen, and then as people stop spending as much money and pumping it into their local economies. You can see it all across the country where people are spending less money and people are, not working up to 1 day a week less in the government or even losing their jobs altogether.
So there's the potential for a renewed recession as a result of this thing, certainly a slowdown, a crimp in the recovery at the very least. And yet it seems as though we're full speed ahead and heading right towards it. Is there any optimism out there that we'll be able to stop this thing before it hits?
Right now, I don't see much optimism about this. You're hearing from Republican leaders on the Hill, from people who have been trying to fight and stop this, even people who support the Pentagon and the military, that sequestration looks like it's going to happen. The Democrats in the Senate are kind of talking past the House Republicans who have their own ideas about how to avert this. Right now, neither one of them are talking about the same things as a way to offset these spending cuts. And so, as we are about 2 weeks away now, it looks more and more like it's going to happen.
There are some lawmakers actually advocating to go over the, are we calling it the sequester cliff at this point? Who are they and what is their argument in favor of letting the sequester happen?
You have a lot of conservative House members who are saying that the sequestration should happen. I guess it's just kind of being called sequestration. No fancy name yet for it that I've heard. The reason why is because this is $1.2 trillion that is already kind of baked into law and that will happen as they're looking overall to try and trim the deficit. This is money that, they would prefer to just kind of chalk up and count toward the deficit reduction. And even if it does mean cuts to government programs and layoffs, they'll take it as a way to, to fulfill the promise they've made to their constituents to cut into the deficit. And
Darren, play Republican consultant for me for just a moment. Is this the last bit of leverage that those Republicans have in trying to get their cut the government agenda through?
No, it's not the last bit of leverage. There's going to be a government spending bill to fund the entire federal government that expires on March 27th, so a couple of weeks after this sequester deadline. So another opportunity for them to make cuts to government spending. If they don't reach an agreement on that, then the government shuts down heading into April, and that's obviously creates more economic problems. And then, of course, we will be back again to dealing with the debt limit extension, which is how this debate really all started when Republicans were forcing sort of spending cuts in turn for raising the debt limit. So there are more opportunities ahead.
Let me ask the naive question, because this is an artificial construct that everybody for the most part agrees would be incredibly damaging. Nobody's talking about just eliminating the sequester altogether. Why not? And is there potential political downside if Republicans were to give in on this?
I think there is for Republicans to give in, certainly. Obviously, you have the fear of facing primary challenges from the right. If people were to let sequestration or avert it, this is the debt reduction that conservatives would be pushing and primary challenging, Republicans who don't go along with it. In terms of, is anyone offering ideas to just outright avoid it? Yeah, you are hearing those from Senate Democrats and you are hearing them from House Republicans, but they're just totally different ideas of ways to offset this $1.2 trillion.
We were talking about something called crisis fatigue in our editorial meeting this morning. I mean, we've heard about the fiscal cliff, we've heard about the debt limit, now the sequester. Do you think there's a sense that, here we go again with the Congress that cried wolf on these sorts of things? A lot of people may be figuring they're going to talk right up to the deadline and probably pass something at the last minute. Is there a sense that it's getting less attention or that there might be less of a political downside that people have to pay because everybody's so fatigued with all these crises?
That is certainly one thing to keep in mind, is we have had obviously the fiscal cliff, and then we just had the debt limit negotiations, and now here's another one, and obviously they did pull those other two out. But it just seems like that's kind of the way that this Congress is going. This is the way the last Congress went as well. It's very dysfunctional up here in terms of where the House and the Senate are and what their leaders are talking about. I think at this point in time, you're just kind of in different worlds, these parties, and they'll deal with the political consequences as they come. Obviously, if sequestration happens, you are going to see some effects around the country.
All right. Well, let's get into this conversation. We're going to break this into two parts. We're going to talk about the politics, which is a huge part of that in the next segment. But right now, I want to also talk about the real fiscal impact this could have on the country. And joining us is Anthony Figliola. He's a political consultant and vice president at Empire Government Strategies. And I think that there's a sense out there, we were talking about this in our morning meeting, Andrew and I, of just fatigue, Anthony, that people are so sick and tired of typical DC dysfunction. They can't agree on everything, but right at the 11th hour, they'll figure something out. So it's almost like, Chicken Little. I don't believe it anymore. This time, and we were going through the calendar, Boehner already said, let the Senate deal with it. Let them work it out. But they really have 4 working days, am I right? And then it's got to go to the House. It's looking more likely than this thing's happening than it's not. This has got to be scaring the bejesus, from credit rating to the markets. This is very real. And I think people just getting their hands around it, don't you? That, my gosh, if this happens, this is not good for America.
Yeah, when I was listening to Leon Panetta, the defense secretary, when he was talking in Congress, he said that, you know, the defense budget is going to be cut by, you know, close to 10%, and it's just a shell of what it once was. And to hear that coming from the defense secretary was a scary thing. They have been, you're right, Rich, they've been playing chicken for so long that now, you know, the chickens have come home to roost, and the question is, what are we going to do? I think at the end of the day, they're going to do something to kick the can down the road, because there is just too much at stake.
Though? Because it's got to go through both chambers.
There's always time.
There's time, because this thing rolls out slowly or in piecemeal. But Anthony,
wait, just one thing on that, because to me, Andrew, you're right. It's not like the cuts all of a sudden happen day one. But the markets don't respond in kind.
Well, that's exactly the point that I was making. You hear defense cuts and everybody thinks, boy, our troops, or we're not going to have enough for missiles or airplanes. But it's not just that. It's the jobs that generates, and it's people who are going to have to be laid off at defense contractors. And even if you don't get to the actual layoffs or the cutoffs, think about, you know, if you've ever gone through a supermarket and you're not sure if you've got enough room on your credit card to pay, like, you're very nervous when you're walking down the aisle. It affects everything even before you actually get to the point of crisis.
But markets don't like volatility.
Right.
And the volatility index, as we know in the market, is one of the biggest indicators. This creates uncertainty.
Oh, yeah.
This creates uncertainty not just in the U.S., but all our debt holders. All of a sudden, if the U.S., for crying out loud, not that this is the same situation, but we had the debate over, you know, whether we were going to service our debt, where we're going to pay our debts, the full faith and credit of the United States. It's not just that we look like clowns. All of a sudden, people that have a vested interest in the U.S. economy get skittish. The market goes crazy. We don't need this right now. This is self-induced, and I think it gives a lot of pause in the short, medium, and long term to people considering the U.S. with the current political construct as safe a bet as it always was, the safe place to put your money. If we'll do this to ourselves, self-induced, with the sequester, you're more confident than I think he and I are. You think they're going to work something out?
I think they're going to work something out, but don't get me wrong. I agree with you, Andrew, that this is the wrong tack to do. If you look at municipalities around the country having the same types of issues where they're playing budget games, one-shots, sell a building, and somehow we're going to magically fix the budget this year, S&P and Moody's are looking at them and saying, you know, what about your bond rating over the long term? We have those kinds of issues. And when we talk about Greece, and I know everybody says, well, that won't be America, but look at where we're going. Look at the value of the dollar. Look at the amount of debt and the deficit.
From there.
We are, but this is how it starts, and that conversation needs to be had. And this is the problem. And I think we are going off a major economic cliff.
But it's kind of like somebody who says, all right, we got to get the nation's attention. Let's shoot ourselves in the foot. Then everyone will listen to me. If this is the dumbest thing I can think of, if you want to focus on it.
It's funny, I was thinking of a different gun reference. I was thinking of it as Russian roulette, because we keep having these artificial constructs, these artificial deadlines, and we keep spinning the chamber on these things. And eventually one of them is going to go off.
Yeah, it's a little scarier, but I like yours better than mine. All right. Now, trust me, I know you're saying, Rich, it's Friday. Do I really want to talk about the sequester?
Rich, it's Friday. Do you really want
Thank you. Now, when we come back, though, as always, when D.C. screws around with stuff like this, there are political consequences, and there's a lot of politics. In fact, that's really what's driving the sequester fight here. And somebody's going to be blamed here in the not-too-distant future if, in fact, this thing becomes reality. So when we come back, we're going to tell you who we think will be left holding the political bag here. All that and much more straight after this.